tell you one thing for sure. We don't need a liberal person in there, a Democrat. We do not need somebody that's going to be bad on crime, bad on borders, bad with the military, bad for the Second Amendment. If you look at what is really going on, and you look at all the things that have happened over the last 48 hours, he totally denies it. He says it didn't happen. And, you know, you have to listen to him also. 40 years is a long time. He's run 8 races, and this has never come up. So 40 years is a long time. The women are Trump voters. Most of them are Trump voters. All you can do is you have to do what you have to do. He totally denies it.
President Trump weighing in for the first time on Roy Moore, the Senate candidate, the Republican Senate candidate in Alabama. The Democrat down there, Doug Jones, responding late this afternoon.
I feel like my record speaks for itself, and I don't have to have the president or anyone else to talk about it or try to label it. I know my record on crime and criminal justice issues. I know my record on everything else. And so that's it. You know, we've got 3 weeks to go. People are going to make that judgment.
Most recent polls in the Real Clear Politics average of polls, recent polls, has Doug Jones up 0.2 in this race down there in Alabama as we are ticking down the days to Election Day for that special election. Let's bring in our panel from Washington. Amy Walter, national editor for the Cook Political Report. Michael Crowley, senior foreign affairs correspondent for Politico. And from New York, Lisa Booth, columnist with the Washington Examiner. Amy, the president finally weighing in. Your thoughts on this day?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is now we have basically 3 positions from Republicans in the state and in Washington on Roy Moore. You have one group of Republicans personified by the governor of the state, Kay Ivey, who say, I believe the women accusers, but I think it's important that we vote for Roy Moore for policy purposes. We have Republicans in Washington, most Republican senators in Washington saying, I believe the women accusers, and Roy Moore should either step down or, if he does get elected, should be expelled. And now we have a third version, which is the president saying, well, I don't know who to believe. The women, that was a long time ago. Roy Moore says he didn't do it. And, oh, by the way, we should vote for Roy Moore because his opponent is a liberal, and don't deny me another seat in the Senate. It's really unclear, though, about what impact this is going to have in the race, where you're having, at the same time the president is talking, the women who have accused Roy Moore going on television in their own right, including most recently yesterday, one of the women who was 14 years old, going on the Today Show and telling her story. So this is really taking this to a different political level. But for voters in Alabama, they've also seen and heard these women in their own words. They don't have to see it filtered through the political process.
Yeah, Lisa, we're going to talk about all of the other things happening on this front, in the sexual harassment front up on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. But on this race, to have the president essentially come out and a non-endorsement and say it's more important to get a Republican in that seat is an interesting move today.
Well, and also to add to Amy's point and just the complexity facing Alabama voters and trying to make this decision before Election Day, you also have Doug Jones, the Democrat candidate, essentially running an ad with Ivanka Trump's statement that there's a special place in hell for someone who preys on children. And then you also have the Attorney General.
A piece of that. I'll come back to you right after this. I'm going to run a little piece of this ad from Doug Jones.
Sure.
On Roy Moore's disturbing actions, Ivanka Trump says there's a special place in hell for people who prey on children, and I have no reason to doubt the victims' accounts. Jeff Sessions says, I have no reason to doubt these young women. And Richard Shelby says he will absolutely not vote for Roy Moore. Conservative voices, putting children and women over party, doing what's right.
So the Jones campaign, Lisa, trying to use Trump versus Trump, I guess.
Right, which is a smart move politically. And then you also have the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who has said that he has no reason to doubt these women as well. So you've got some very complex and very interesting dynamics at play here in Alabama. And as you said, the race is within the margin of error, according to Real Clear Politics. And ultimately, this is going to be up to Alabama voters. You know, who do they trust in this scenario heading into Election Day? And if you're Republicans as well, or the Senate, and let's say Roy Moore is elected, you know, there's been expelling and things like that have been put forward. So what do you do with a duly elected member of the United States Senate? And what sort of precedent does that set for someone like Senator Al Franken? Or, you look on the House side as well with someone like Representative Conyers. And undoubtedly, like the likelihood that we're going to hear more accusations of members of Congress, I would assume, here in the coming weeks and months. So what happens to fellow senators who are accused of things similarly? So there's a lot of interesting things going on in the country right now in the race of Alabama, as well as in the United States Congress.
Yeah, Quinnipiac, Michael, has this poll out, and one of the questions is, should the Senate expel more? Should he win? Should the Senate expel more if he wins the Alabama Senate race? The total is 60% yes, 28% no, but look at GOP voters. 33-49 don't expel. In Alabama, this is playing differently. And I think, isn't that something to factor in as we look at this race?
It is something to factor in, and that partisan breakdown or breakout there underscores the way in which even what is really ought to be an evidentiary issue has been subsumed by partisan politics. And Trump himself saw this during the 2016 campaign. I mean, Trump himself, of course, was the subject of quite a lot of allegations of sexual misconduct that quite a lot of people found to be credible. But at the end of the day, it seemed that what mattered was voters' larger preferences, and either people made a decision that they thought the behavior of the individual was less important than the policies that he represented, or they just didn't trust the accusers because we were in such a partisan climate. And if anything, the partisan climate is even worse now in Alabama. But I think in Trump, in taking this position today, has got to be remembering the way in which in 2016 he was able to portray the accusations against him in part as part of a kind of a conspiracy engineered by the Washington political media establishment against him. And again, either a lot of people believed that it was a conspiracy, or ultimately decided that what was more important was the policy outcome than the character of the man. And I think that we may be seeing a replay of that here, although it's still obviously a close race.
But Amy, quickly, you're not going to get Roy Moore out of this race.
You're absolutely not. No. And then what's remarkable about the way that Roy Moore has been running this campaign is he's been focused solely on Roy Moore, and he spent very little time talking about Doug Jones. Today, again, his campaign going out, defending themselves, going after the credibility of these women. And, to Michael's point about Donald Trump was able to essentially, get through this storm of accusations and, of course, the Access Hollywood tape. The difference in this case is that there are women who are on the front page of the Alabama papers, who are on national television, telling their story directly to voters. So this is no longer just about there's a media conspiracy. It is really now the individuals being able to talk about this. And again, if you're Roy Moore and you're spending more time trying to defend and discredit women than you are talking about either your policies or about your opponent, that's not a great place to be just a couple of weeks out from Election Day.